Hello and good evening to you, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to the 2025 Kilbrandon Children's Research Webinar, Masculinities, Understanding the Sport Needs of Boys and Young Men in the Care and Youth Justice System. I'm Dr Graham Connelly, and I'm very pleased to be your host for what I know will be an enjoyable and informative experience. More than 140 people have registered for this webinar, joining us from locations around Scotland and the UK and elsewhere in Europe, representing universities, colleges, schools, local authorities, government agencies, and the private and third sectors, and care experience communities. Some of you may be wondering about the name Kilbrandon in the webinar title. This is because the webinar is organised by the team which also arranges the annual Kilbrandon Lecture, a town and gown lecture held annually in recognition of the report by a committee chaired by the late Charles James Dalrymple Shaw, a Scottish judge known as Lord Kilbrandon, which led to the Scotland's Children's Hearing System and the Social Work Scotland Act 1968. This year's lecture was given last week by Professor Carleen Furman. I know that some of you participating tonight heard Carleen talk about contextual safeguarding and make a call for the cultural reforms required to safeguard children beyond their homes. The Kilbrandon lecture continued online during the COVID restrictions, and this webinar, now in its 5th year, was born out of our experience of using this medium, which draws in a more geographically diverse audience. The webinar is presented under the auspices of the University's Department of Social Work and Social Policy and University Corporate Events. I'll now introduce the webinar. We're going to hear 3 presentations from experts researching and working with boys and young men, helping us to consider particular aspects of masculinity. After the last presentation, there will be a 5-minute comfort break, and when we return, there will be a panel discussion chaired by Raymond Taylor. As you listen to the presentations, you can pose questions or make observations using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please note that the chat function in Zoom is disabled. If you have questions for particular speakers, put their name at the start of your text. Raymond will use your questions to help structure the discussion. Unfortunately, the number of participants and the time available means that we can't come to you individually for comment. Masculinity, or the supposed characteristics of maleness, of being a man, has occupied countless column inches and the equivalent in social media in recent times as a result of the activities of certain hyper-masculinized personalities and even state actors. Viewed historically, concern about masculinity and the socialization of boys is not recent, and neither is it one-dimensional. For example, concerns about boys' physical development and capacity for soldiering can coexist with worries about the objectification of women and the role of sex education in preventing harassment and abuse of women. Our webinar title is deliberately plural. As the historian Erica Fraser of Carleton University in Canada points out, historians have studied masculinities as shifting cultural constructs from the ancient to the modern eras in all parts of the world and across dozens of themes. So let's move on to the presentations from our panel of expert speakers. Our first presentation by Nina Vaswani and Ian Corbett is titled Masculinities Under Pressure: Marginalization, Misconceptions and Mental Health. Dr. Nina Vaswani is Senior Research Fellow at the Children and Young People Centre for Justice at the University of Strathclyde. Nina's research interests are the experience and impact of loss, bereavement and trauma in young people, and how these experiences interface and influence contact with the justice system. Of particular interest is the overrepresentation of young men in justice settings and how their experiences of marginalization, disadvantage and trauma might shape their developing masculinities, mental health behaviors and outcomes. Nina was principal investigator on the Men Minds project, which was co-produced with young men aged 16 to 24 and aimed to better understand marginalised young men's mental health and reduce barriers to mental health help seeking and participation in mental health research for young men. Nina is currently developing a range of research outputs and direct work with boys and young men following the completion of this project. Ian Corbett is a participation, policy and engagement advisor also at the Children and Young People's Centre for Justice. Ian is an experienced participation and community development practitioner with a keen interest in addressing the inequalities that both lead to and are experienced by young men in conflict with the law. Most recently, Ian has been working extensively in Her Majesty's Prison and Young Offenders Institution Polmont to deliver Activate, a University of Glasgow certified introduction to community development. Over the past 2 years, Ian has designed and delivered workshops exploring masculinity with young men in conflict with the law in both community and custodial settings, and is currently facilitating a longer-term project which creates space for young men to explore, reflect, and be critical of their ideas on masculinity and how they were formed. Welcome, Nina and Ian. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Graham, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar this evening, and thank you very much for that introduction. We have some great speakers to hear from today, and so I just want to spend a few minutes setting the scene for the webinar by outlining why I believe there is a need to focus attention on boys and young men's well-being, primarily drawing from my work on the Men Minds project. As Graham said, people seem to be talking a lot about boys and young men nowadays. Contemporary concerns include sexism, problematic use of technology, addiction to porn, misogyny, violence, often against women and girls, toxic masculinity, engagement with far-right ideologies, and many other harms. Now, these concerns are real, and they are in part the legacy of a patriarchal society and in part related to today's wider challenges and societal change. Austerity, cost of living, the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, lack of employment opportunities, the disenfranchisement of young people, and technology that continues to evolve at a pace faster than policy and practice can keep up with, to name just a few. And it is these very real concerns that also mean that at times there can be something of a compassion gap when it comes to supporting boys and young men more generally. Now, the response to Men Minds has been phenomenal, but we have had a bit of pushback for focusing on young men. And I definitely believe that there are benefits in being a woman taking on this work, as it's easier to demonstrate that you can be firmly rooted in a feminist perspective and acknowledge the existence of male privilege and harm, while also acknowledging that this legacy can also harm boys and young men in multiple ways and can obscure the challenges that boys and young men often face. Yes, it's right to focus attention on the needs of women and girls, but it's certainly not a zero-sum game. And I think whatever your position, it's clear that change will be created by bringing boys and young men alongside us, and that the outcomes we want to see won't be achieved if the starting point for action is shame and blame. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I guess on the face of it, I think the mental health statistics paint a fairly promising picture for boys and young men, at least compared to girls and young women. Boys are more likely to report feeling very happy overall with life, and they report being less anxious about their studies and enjoying school more. Certainly, girls make up almost 2/3 of all referrals to in-school counselling, and more girls are referred to child and adolescent mental health services than boys. And in the latest Scotland census, the percentage of young men with a diagnosed mental health condition was almost half that of young women. So on the face of it, the future looks rosy for boys and young men, right? However, when you consider not just the official mental health statistics, but data that is closely related to mental health, the picture begins to look somewhat different. Next slide, please. Boys comprise almost all young people who are excluded from school, and they underperform compared to girls in every stage of secondary education, especially at the top grades. Young men are more likely to not be in education, employment, or training. And a report from Sheru highlighted what it termed deaths of despair when they reported that 2/3 of drug and alcohol deaths are in men aged 18 to 44. Men comprised 83% of those convicted at court in 2023, and they tend to receive longer and more custodial sentences, even when adjusted for offence type. So where this ultimately leads is to the fact that approximately 95% of the prison population in Scotland, and indeed globally, are men. And of course, the starkest point, for me anyway, is that suicide is the leading cause of death for young people in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK. But around 3/4 of all suicides in the UK are boys or men. So I ask you today, does that paint a picture to you of a society where young men are happy, confident and thriving? Or perhaps it simply highlights that the mental health statistics might only be telling part of the story. Next slide, please. In Men Minds, we wanted to explore this and engage with young men to be part of the change. Men Minds was funded by UKRI as part of the Adolescents Mental Health and Developing Mind programme. Our primary aim was to better understand young men's mental health and to improve mental health research for young men, as we know that they are underrepresented in mental health research, meaning that the evidence to inform policy and practice may not be as reflective of their needs and experiences. In Men Minds, we engage with young men who might be more marginalised in society. Young men who were refugees, asylum seekers or migrants, young men who had experience with the justice system, or young men who identified as LGBTQ+. At the heart of the project was the Young People's Forum, a group of 10 young men who co-produced the research and undertook fieldwork with 60 of their peers across Scotland. They supported us with analysis, co-produced outputs, including the comic, of which you can see some images from the comic in these slides. And the young men undertook significant dissemination, including at the Scottish Parliament. I cannot acknowledge these young men's contribution to this project enough, and they are still showing up to this day and making a difference for themselves and for other young men. Next slide, please. So what did young men tell us? The theme of marginalisation and misconceptions about young men loomed large in their descriptions of being a young man today. Many of the young men were dealing with the ramifications of poor or difficult school experiences, often related to undiagnosed or unsupported neurodiversity. These experiences profoundly affected their self-esteem and future opportunities. Socioeconomic conditions and structural factors also played a significant role in shaping their identities and mental health. Economic inactivity and unemployment are increasing for 16 to 24-year-olds. And the cost of living crisis made life really quite grim for young people and their ability to even just have a basic quality of life. It certainly affected their ability to engage in positive activities to support well-being, such as a gym membership, hobbies, or even just having a social life. Young men also described feeling very isolated, lonely, and excluded. This was particularly true of young men who had migrated to the UK, but this was generally true of all young men. At this transitional time of adolescence, where young men are moving towards independence and young adulthood, their friendship groups and family support shift and change. Excuse me. And this meant that young men didn't have social networks from within which to seek support. And even if they did have peer groups, these were not necessarily deep and meaningful relationships. They were often more superficial and transactional. Many young men were also caught in a complex and conflicted state of identity, whether this was to do with their age, their culture, gender, or sexual identities. The advice and guidance they received from their parents and their elders' ways of doing things no longer seemed to work for them in the modern world. But they were caught between these worlds of how things once were, how they are, and how they wanted things to be. Particularly for young men who were more marginalised, they really felt the weight of stereotypes and discrimination upon their identities and mental health, whether to do with class, race, justice, or immigration status. But this really applied to all participants in our research, who felt associated with these negative stereotypes of young men and who often felt judged and shamed simply for existing as a young man. These are not the conditions that support good mental health. Next slide, please. Men Minds highlighted how misconceptions about young men and between young men have a deleterious effect on how young men are able to talk about mental health and their social connections, relationships, and well-being. Our findings did confirm the assumption that young men don't talk about mental health, but not because they don't want to, but because their environments were not conducive to it. For many young men, their masculinities were in a state of flux in transition. As they grew older and developed their own ideas about masculinities, as well as their own experiences with mental health, many young men found their masculine transitions were stuck in limbo because of the pervasive influence, real or perceived, of traditional masculine norms all around them, in their peer groups, their families, their schools, and in society. Young men often assumed that other men and other women still expected them to behave in a certain way. These misconceptions meant that young men found themselves caught up in a performance of erroneous expectations, either their own expectations or others, where essentially young men found it difficult to be their own authentic selves, to trust others, to open up, or to seek help when it was needed. Next slide, please. Luckily, Men Minds has also shown us what some of the solutions might be. And these are not radical, they really are just common sense. Providing young men with spaces where they are welcomed and that facilitate a sense of community and connection. Engaging young men in activities that provide them with agency and purpose, which is missing from so many of the opportunities currently available to them. By providing permission, but no pressure to talk about mental health. And lastly, I was absolutely blown away by the wonderful, supportive community that the young men in Men Minds created for each other. Who better to support and understand young men than young men themselves? Next slide, please. And just before I finish up, I think this slide highlights the very tangible benefits of engaging boys and young men. While Men Minds definitely wasn't therapy, the process was certainly therapeutic for them. And on that note, I'll pass over to Ian, who really has been doing so much of this work directly with young men for such a long time.
Thanks, Nina, and hello, everyone. I am Ian, and as was mentioned earlier, I'm a participation policy and engagement advisor at the Children and Young People Centre for Justice. I am not an academic. My job is not to do research with young men, but rather to work with them and use the research evidence as it emerges to underpin everything I do in my practice. What I'm going to do is spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about some of the projects we have in Polmont, but doing that through the lens of the potential solutions that Nina has offered up through the Men Minds research project. Next slide, please. So we'll take a very quick look at those same 5 categories, looking at some of the work that we're doing around non-judgmental spaces, belonging and connection, agency and purpose, permission but no pressure, and the value of peer support. Next slide, please. The first group I'm going to talk about is Inside Out. Inside Out is a joint project with CYCJ and the Scottish Through Care and Aftercare Forum, and it's a curated space for justice and care experienced young people. The space is designed to address the overrepresentation of care experience within the prison population, with evidence showing it could be as high as 70% of young men within the YY have some form of care experience. This is a space where young people not only have the opportunity to influence system change and policy and legislation specific to their experiences, but it's also to address the inequalities faced by the unique group at every level of our system. Next slide, please. When we think of belonging and connection, we know that young men feel disconnected from community and from society. And when we think about belonging and connection, it's naive to expect them to simply reconnect. With that in mind, we deliver Activate. So Activate is a University of Glasgow product. It is a 12-week course which is certified by the university, and it's an introduction to community development theory and practice. Originally, the course was designed to give community change makers who weren't recognised in maybe the way they should, or weren't able to mobilise or leverage their power in the way that they should or could, the skills and recognition of the work that they were doing. We have been delivering that in Polmont now over the last year, and with great effect. With that, though, you get a guaranteed interview for the University of Glasgow's undergraduate degree course, and I will come back to that later on today. Next slide, please. Future change. Well, we're thinking about agency and purpose. We have a young person's quote there that says, "Of all the things I was involved in prison, this one feels the most important." We had a group of Activate graduates who came to me at the end of the project, talking around how they had learned about social policy, how they'd learned about oppressive systems and how to leverage power, and that it felt like the beginning and not the end. And therefore, we set up a new group called Future Change. Future Change was able to secure £75,000 from the Cora Foundation and used that money to take on social action projects within HMP and YOI Polmont, excuse me. They bought Christmas hampers for every young person within the estate, recognising that not everyone has family or gifts across the holiday period. They've done a series of community murals, they've done a participatory budgeting project, and they've even funded one of the young people who's recently been released from Polmont to record an album of tracks that was written within his time in custody. Next slide, please. Positive choices is all around permission, but no pressure. So the quote there, I suppose I never thought about it like that. Can I come back to you next week? Positive choices is an SPS, Scottish Prison Service course. It's not a CYCJ course, but it's one we were invited on to talk about healthy masculinities. A group of 8 young men at any given time do a 10-day course, which covers a whole host of subjects. And I was invited to talk to the young people around masculinities, with the sort of idea that it would open up the conversation, but it wouldn't be something that would be drilled down too deeply into at that point. But that leads me to the next piece of work, which I'm going to talk about, which is Man Up. So next slide, please. So Man Up is a space for young men to explore masculinity safely, without judgment, and crucially to support one another. Every week, the young men, we were spending 16 weeks together, currently 12 young men taking part in that course. And every week they'll do a well-being check-in, followed by mindfulness, with conversations about the need to be able to identify emotions, to be able to emotionally regulate, and to be able to decompress at times where they are feeling the pressures of their mental health or the stressors of their environment. In the initial weeks of the project, we spent time laying out what masculinity means to them as young men. What are the privileges? What are the challenges? What are the misconceptions? What are the expectations? And we have mapped all of that out. They will spend the next period looking at creating a survey. The survey will go to every man that they can come in contact with about their experience of masculinity. So that could be prison staff, young people who are currently resident within the prison, family members, and external staff as well. They're also going to do some interviews with people who have been in the justice system and are now doing community work. And then what they'll do is learn about the fact that they have been doing quantitative and qualitative research. They'll do some basic analysis. And in March or April, there'll be a presentation around what their views on masculinity were, how they've changed, who they spoke to through the survey, who they spoke to through the interviews, and hopefully we've got an opportunity to change some hearts and minds. There might be an opportunity for anyone in the audience to come along to that event. It will be friends, family, etc. first, but I'll post that on LinkedIn. So if anyone follows me there and would like to come along, then I will put details of that up there. With the Man Up group, though, like I said, as part of a piece of work we were doing around restorative justice, we started to map out what it was to be a young man in 2025. And Nina already touched on some of this. There was a quote earlier in the slides, which is, they try to teach you to be one way, but life teaches you something else. And when we dug deeper into what that meant, it painted a pretty bleak picture. Growing up in 2025, what young people see, despite being told to behave otherwise, is constant conflict, constant polarisation, and constant stress within communities and society. A young person of 21 has spent the majority of their life under austerity measures. They've had religious and political division in the form of sectarianism, particularly in Scotland, causing division within communities. They had an independence referendum, which politically split the country in two, and then it was further dismantled by a Brexit referendum not long after. There's been war and genocides on the global stage for every single year of a 21-year-old person's existence. We then had the global pandemic, which not only interrupted their social relationships, their education, even their neurodevelopment, but caused young people to lose loved ones. Coming out of the pandemic, there was then people trying to convince them that the COVID pandemic wasn't even a real thing and that maybe they shouldn't be taking the vaccine that could provide you the safeguarding that you would need. And finally, we task our young people with saving the planet from extinction, from a climate emergency that wasn't their fault. That's just the universal problems. That's the problems faced by every young person. It doesn't take into consideration the socioeconomic conditions, their home life, their trauma, their exposure to violence or addictions. The young men told us as well that they keep being told that they have to do better and they have to be better and they have to find positive role models. But the young men also mapped out the fact that they come from communities of multiple deprivation in most instances. And it's not that we don't have successful and reliable role models coming from these communities. Absolutely, there are academics, there are police officers, there are lawyers, there are doctors that come from deprived communities. But the first thing they do when they get any money or any social mobility is leave those communities. So the people that are left with for aspiration for these young people are universally the criminals that are left to be the role models. So how do young men navigate this? Our young men need to do better. They can do better. But from what I'm seeing, they're already doing better. And that's why I wanted to highlight some of this work, because supposedly I work with some of Scotland's most dangerous young men, men that are seen as the biggest burden on society. I work with them weekly in a very brutal environment, but what I see every week is beautiful. The Inside Out group met with the Justice Secretary to demand better for all care and justice experience young people and created welcome packs for new admissions in HMPYY Pullman. Future Change hosted a Dragon's Den as part of their participatory budget and allocated over £40,000 to community organisations that supported care and justice young people. Man Up are creating a whole host of resources that are encouraging young men to talk about mental health while they're in custody. And Activate has led to an improved dialogue between young men and the Scottish Prison Service. It's also seen 3 young men receive unconditional offers to university, with one of them still in prison in April this year, starting his course this September. But what do they need? Well, they need love and they need compassion and they need empathy and they need hope. We don't need to ignore the harm that they've caused. There can still be accountability and still be responsibility, but it's only when we give these young people a chance that we can see change. I know that because I was a young person that was in the justice system and now I'm sitting here talking to you guys tonight. So the parting message that I have for all of you, but especially the men that are here tonight and that are listening, is lean in. We can't just tell our young men that they need to be different. We need to show them how. In some instances, we're also going to need to learn alongside them. I get to see a side of the young men within HMPYY Pullman that I wish everyone else could see. And I think it's one of our biggest failings as a society, that it takes young men to be locked up away from the world before they feel safe enough to be themselves, before they feel safe enough to love themselves or to love others. Yes, absolutely. As Nina pointed out, we need to support our women and girls. They are being failed by systems and structures and individuals every single day. But we also need to support our young men too. We need to create the space for them to show up to be the beautiful human beings that they were always meant to be. And everyone will reap the rewards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for those words at the end there. And thank you to Nina before you. Our next presentation will be given by Ayesha Sheikh and is entitled The Role of Masculinity as a Barrier to Adolescent Boys and Young Men's Help Seeking for Mental Health. Ayesha Sheikh is a research officer in the Evidence-Based Practice Unit, EBPU, at Anna Freud Centre and University College London. Her work is focused on studies related to young people's mental health and well-being, including the evaluation of school-based interventions and the needs of underrepresented groups. Ayesha, we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Graham. And hello, everyone. And thank you to Nina and Ian as well for your presentation. I thought it was really fascinating to hear about your project. So thank you. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to speak to you about my research. So thank you very much for having me. I'm going to be talking about a paper that we published earlier this year entitled "Why Do Young Men Not Seek Help for Affective Mental Health Issues? A systematic review of perceived barriers and facilitators among adolescent boys and young men." Essentially, we wanted to know what evidence was already available on this topic and if there were any gaps in the literature. I'm going to talk about why we did this review and what we found. Going forward, I will just be referring to our population as young men for clarity, but please note this does include adolescent boys as well. Next slide, please. So firstly, I want to acknowledge my co-authors. Just on the next slide, please. I shared joint first authorship of this paper with Chloe Payne-Cook, who was at the University of Bath at the time. We worked alongside our co-authors Steve Lisk, Ben Carter, and June Brandt from King's College London. Next slide, please. I'd like to quickly give some context to our review and where it came from. So a couple of years ago, we at Anna Freud were involved with the BEST study, which was the Brief Educational Workshops in Secondary Schools trial. This was alongside KCL and the partners that you can see along the bottom of the slide here. If you haven't heard of it, BEST was a cluster randomized controlled trial evaluating the effectiveness of day-long stress workshops on symptoms of depression in sixth form students. The workshops were run within schools alongside school mental health support teams, or MHSTs. I'm not sure if there's something similar in Scotland, but MHSTs are an NHS England initiative to support pupils' mental health within the school setting. So these teams helped us by delivering the intervention, and we worked on the recruitment and evaluation side. So the study was open to all students, regardless of which gender they identified as, but we wanted to make sure that all groups were well represented. So we were mindful of ways to engage boys and young men with the study in particular. So focus groups were run prior to the trial starting to see what we could do to improve their engagement, and that informed our recruitment approaches. So the focus group suggested things like transparency and honesty about why we needed males especially to take part. And also they suggested using a male role model like a teacher to help with recruitment. So we wanted to build on this work with the young men by examining more closely the reasons they shared for preferring these approaches, which is why we decided to carry out this review. Next slide, please. So we knew this was an important topic because, and Nina touched on some of these statistics in her part of the presentation. But of course, we already know that adult men are less likely to seek help for their mental health than women, but less is known about the specific patterns of help seeking in younger men. There's a lot of literature out there about youth in general, older men or clinical populations, but less about young men specifically in the general population. And this is concerning as this group have high suicide rates but a low take-up of services. It's therefore really important that we understand more about their access needs. Next slide, please. So the aim of the review we carried out was to identify the barriers and facilitators faced by young men in help seeking for affective mental health disorders. So what factors make it more difficult or easier for them to seek help? By affective disorders, just to clarify, we meant mood disorders like depression and anxiety, and we also considered stress and well-being as part of that. And it's important to build our understanding so that interventions and programs can be developed that are accessible and effective for young men. Encouraging help seeking at the early stages of mental health difficulties could ensure that problems are addressed before they develop into more serious issues, such as severe depression or suicide. Next slide, please. Now, regarding the methods we used, we searched 3 databases and that gave us nearly 4,000 articles. We narrowed this down to 12 eligible articles to include in our review. There were a mix of qualitative and quantitative papers. 4 of the studies were based in the UK, 3 were from Australia, 3 from the USA, and 1 was based in Ireland. Most of the studies took place in a school or university setting. We, of course, followed strict inclusion criteria for the articles. So studies had to include boys and young men aged between 14 and 22 years of age. And we chose that age range because we wanted to focus on a specific and overlooked period of adolescence and young adulthood, rather than the full spectrum up to emerging adulthood. We also include studies with participants who are seeking help for effective mental health concerns or discussing intentions or likelihood of seeking help for these concerns. We chose to only focus on these disorders due to their commonality in young men globally. And finally, we wanted studies where most participants did not have a clinical diagnosis of an established mental health condition. And that was decided on the basis that those with a diagnosis were more likely to be mental health service users who were already help seekers. And we really wanted to focus on the sort of group that hadn't got to help seeking yet. Next slide, please. So this graphic summarises our 5 key themes and the 4 sub-themes that we identified in our results. The impact of social norms with 2 sub-themes and limited availability of information were identified as barriers. Male-friendly campaigns and self-compassion were facilitators, and help-seeking preferences was a theme referring to trends in help-seeking with 2 sub-themes identified within that. I'm going to talk you through what we found in relation to these themes. Next slide, please. Our first theme was about the impact of social norms, and all 12 of our papers identified our first sub-theme of conformity to masculine social norms, or what I'll call CMN for ease, as a barrier to young men's help seeking for mental health. This was often due to the stigmatisation of mental health difficulties being seen as a weakness. CMN can be defined as a rigid adherence to stereotypical notions of masculinity that are conceived by society. And those notions can actually be both positive and negative, but for young men in the studies we looked at, they felt that seeking help was embarrassing as it contradicted traditional notions of masculinity, and they felt that they should be able to deal with their problems without professional help. So because of this, they were then more likely to see help seeking in a negative light and as a weak behaviour, and so it was something they needed to avoid to appear more masculine. Masculine norms were also found to be a specific barrier for young black men in the UK in one paper we included. So it was found here that black men felt very strongly the social pressure to be strong and to cope independently. Participants here identified mental strength as a key traditional trait for black men in the UK, and they perceived that this came from a generational influence of African Caribbean men needing to be strong to overcome racism. So they felt that there was stronger pressure to conform to masculine norms in black communities more so than in white communities because of this. Next slide, please. Our second sub-theme related to social norms was self-stigma. So this is defined by Colin Ingram as the belief that one is inadequate or weak if he wants to seek professional help. So again, it's that feeling for young men that help seeking is somehow a personal failure because they've not been able to solve their problems themselves. There is a relationship between our 2 sub-themes here, as several studies highlighted that those who endorse greater masculine norms experience higher levels of self-stigma. One study found that men who do experience that are less likely to seek informal help from friends, family, and peers. And they can also be more likely to practice avoidant behaviours, which might explain why there's a high level of substance abuse disorders in young men too. Generational stigma was a barrier to help seeking for many, especially regarding stigma within black communities. And some participants in another study identified facing self-denial in addition to self-stigma, and acknowledged that whilst mental health difficulties were not necessarily a sign of weakness, they felt it was when it related to them personally. So it's quite a complicated picture already emerging. Next slide, please. Theme 2 was about how the limited availability of information on common mental health disorders and help seeking itself could be a barrier to help seeking amongst young men. Young men were often misinformed about the causes of mental health conditions. They saw it as a disability or as something that could not be recovered from. They also felt that people around them, like their parents and teachers, would lack knowledge of mental health conditions, such as anxiety, and therefore would not be able to offer help or support. There was also a lack of knowledge on where to get help, a fear of what treatments might be offered, such as medication, and also just generally being unsure about how to assess the severity of mental health symptoms or not knowing when they would need professional help. For some young men, these factors meant that they saw mental health conditions as a secret problem that they needed to keep to themselves. Next slide, please. Our next theme was on male-friendly campaigns to promote interventions or mental health literacy. And as I mentioned before, this was a facilitator to help seeking. Young men were discussing ways of increasing the availability of information on mental health. It was suggested that using more simple or lay terms could help remove some of the stigma around help seeking, such as calling it a stress intervention rather than one for anxiety or depression. And also just being more transparent about psychological information and general service information and what young men could expect when they sought help. The idea of co-creation was raised. One study identified that there was a need for young men to actually be involved themselves in creating strategies or interventions for mental health support. Encouragingly, young men did see it as possible to reframe help seeking in a way that could complement ideas of masculinity so that it was seen as a sign of strength. Young men in several of the studies mentioned how the use of positive male role models could be beneficial in encouraging them to seek help by facilitating conversations about mental health and helping to shift the notion that help seeking is not a masculine trait. Next slide, please. As I referenced at the start, our theme of help seeking preferences was to do with trends in help seeking and what young men were more or less likely to turn to when they did think about seeking help. There was a lot of crossover between our two sub-themes of informal versus formal help seeking and online versus offline help seeking. So some young men did show a preference for seeking help from informal sources, such as family, friends, and teachers, because they provided them with a sense of familiarity and a shared context and understanding. But for others, they worried that friends wouldn't provide them with appropriate or non-judgmental support. They worried about people responding negatively to them. And of course, they knew that they couldn't rely on anonymity with people they knew. Many had a negative view of professionals. They felt that they either wouldn't be able to help or that it was a last resort or something that existed within a system that was unkind and often discriminatory, especially towards Black men. And so it wasn't something that felt accessible to everyone. Next slide, please. Young men showed a preference for seeking online, sorry, just the previous slide, please. Young men showed a preference for seeking online support via search engines. They saw this as a way of being independent and solving their own problems. This could be a positive as it may help to signpost them towards getting professional help, but also there were concerns that information online might not be correct or be of high quality. There was a link between preferences for offline help seeking and informal sources because young men who reported closeness to their friends and family were more likely to seek help from them because they saw them as trustworthy. Some young men, though, were worried about causing trouble for their parents, or again, they wanted to feel independent. Some just reported feeling more embarrassed going to their parents or family the older they got. With teachers, though, there was slightly less embarrassment because there was a bit of emotional distance, but enough familiarity that it was still a comfortable choice for many. Next slide, please. I will briefly cover our final theme, as although it was a small theme, it's still highly relevant. So this theme was the finding of self-compassion as a facilitator, and essentially that if young men showed kindness to themselves, then this lessened some of the barriers to help seeking we've already discussed, such as conformity to masculine norms and self-stigma. This helped them to see help seeking as a normal part of life without stigma, or at least with less stigma, because they saw help seeking as something that they deserved. Next slide, please. Overall, our findings shed light on several important factors that influence help seeking behaviours in young men. Concepts related to masculinity really do run through all our themes. since we carried out this review, the conversation around good or bad masculinity has only intensified, and these findings are just another reminder of the impact that these ideas can have on young men. The review especially shows that it's important to consider the impact of conformity to masculine norms and self-stigma when designing future interventions and ways to support young men. And it emphasises the need for targeted or tailored interventions and support strategies for this group. It also highlights that it's essential to involve young men in the creation of any new interventions or programs to ensure that they are effective for their target audience. Next slide, please. So we were able to make a few recommendations from our review findings, namely that future research could focus on the impact of self-compassion as a facilitator to help seeking and how we could utilise this to encourage young men to access help when they need it. Perhaps initiatives to build their self-compassion from an early age need to be considered to start with before addressing the act of help seeking itself. Also, there is a lack of research on how race, ethnicity, and sexuality may affect help seeking in young men, so these factors could be topics for future research too. Our findings indicated that mental health services need to consider the impact of masculine social norms and also ensure cultural sensitivity when offering interventions. Clinical interventions and programs to improve knowledge of mental health and help seeking should be delivered with a male-friendly approach. So that's being mindful of language used and things like that. Also, a stepped care approach might be useful here so that men can have a low-pressure avenue into seeking help and then gradually work towards seeking more professional or structured help if they need it. Schools may present the best environment for early interventions in a familiar setting. And this is something already being done in many areas across the country. But findings such as those in this review suggest that these approaches really might have value for young men. So moving on to my final slide now, please. Just to say that the link is here to our full paper, if you wish to read it, with the full reference list of the papers included in our review. And also, if you want to find out more information about the BEST study, the findings were published last year in The Lancet Psychiatry. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have at the end.
Thank you very much, Ayesha. And that's a timely reminder to our participants that you can engage with our speakers this evening by putting questions or comments, indeed, on the Q&A facility on your screen, and they'll be compiled by my colleague Raymond Taylor, who will be chairing a panel session after the next speaker. So we move now to our final presentation this evening, which will be given by Sophie King-Hill, who tonight is speaking to us from the Palace of Westminster. Sophie, I think you're in Portcullis House in an office there. You've been, I understand, giving evidence to a parliamentary committee, and we're grateful that you've delayed your return train, and also to the committee clerk for finding you a place where you could make your presentation. Sophie's presentation is titled Reframing Masculinity, Supporting Men and Boys in a Changing World. Dr. Sophie King-Hill is an Associate Professor at the Health Services Management Centre in the University of Birmingham. Her research focuses on gender, sexual behaviours, youth voice and safeguarding, with a particular emphasis on reframing masculinity and addressing harmful sexual behaviours. She has led multiple national and international projects, including work on incel communities, masculinity in the fire service, and the development of practitioner tools for assessing sexual behaviours in young people. Sophie is the author of Reframing Masculinity for Young Men and Boys, We're in This Together, which was published just last month by Palgrave Macmillan, which explores the complex intersections of identity, mental health, and societal expectations in the lives of boys and young men. Her work combines academic rigour with practical application, aiming to foster inclusive, evidence-informed approaches across education, health, and safeguarding sectors. She regularly advises government departments, as she's doing today, contributes to national policy development, and works closely with practitioners to translate research into meaningful change. Welcome, Sophie, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for having me. Just a little bit of a caveat here, because I'm in the Palace of Westminster. If you hear bells go off, I will mute for a second because that's the call to vote. So it just happened on one of the other talks, so just a bit of a caveat there. So I'm going to talk to you about reframing masculinity for young men and boys, and I'm going to focus on one of the research projects that I've carried out in relation to young men and boys, and actually really truly listening to their voices and what we need to hear most and what we need to change within wider society. Next slide, please. One of the things I wanted to start off with, and I think Nina alluded to it at the start, is that retribution is not the answer. You know, we live in a society where there's a huge blame culture at the moment in lots of different areas, but we see it really profoundly when working with young men and boys. That's not an apologist position. You know, we know that women are overwhelmingly raped, beaten, murdered, and die by suicide because of men. You know, we have the statistical evidence there and we can't escape it. However, looking for retribution and looking for blame is really, really damaging. You know, we have to all work together across genders to try to make it better for everyone, because at the moment nobody is winning. So blame culture shuts down dialogue. Men feel attacked, so they don't engage. So they shut down and they won't communicate. It creates defensiveness and backlash, and it leads to resistance instead of progress. And that's the thing we've got to think about. You know, I'm not saying there shouldn't be consequences for actions. However, this needs to run parallel to a restorative approach and not retribution. We've also got to look at the root causes for wider violences within society, and having a retribution perspective doesn't address identity conflict or societal norms. So we need collaboration, education, and we need to reframe masculinity as inclusive. But we need to change things for all of us through understanding and not just punishment and retribution. So, you know, that's the premise I really want to start this talk off on. Next slide, please. So another premise that I think is really important to remember is that we're more the same than we are different. Society does not set us up like that way. From the moment that we are born, we are conditioned by our outside influences, and one of those conditioning factors is to do with our gender. And wider society implies that we are different, that there's differences across genders, there's differences between boys and girls and men and women, and non-binary folk and trans people. But is this, you know, is this the actual truth? Well, when we boil it down, and these are the concepts that I speak about in my book and the free resource that goes along with it, you know, when we really boil it down, we are more the same than we are different. Biologically, we are more the same than we are different, but also emotionally and psychologically, we're more the same. We all feel fear, shame, sadness, embarrassment, happiness, excitement, hope, love. You know, we all feel those emotions. And I think more often than not, we're set up in society to not see the similarities between people. Next slide, please. I thought it would be really useful as well to kind of strip it back and to look at masculinity itself and what that means. You know, what are masculinities? So Dr Connelly, which I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with, came up with different types of masculinities. So there's the hegemonic masculinity, this kind of culturally ideological form of masculinity that legitimizes male dominance. And examples of that can be those that are physically strong, assertive, heterosexual, successful, and emotionally reserved. There's a subordinate typology of masculinity that Connell came up with that suggested that masculinities that are directly oppressed or seen as inferior, such as gay men or men who are emotional or nurturing, are seen as subordinate within the hierarchy of masculinity. And then there's the complacent, so men who do not fully embody this hegemonic persona and these hegemonic traits, so such as the middle class family men who accept gender norms but aren't aggressive or not dominant, or the marginalised, so masculinities of men who might be excluded due to race, class or disability. So for instance, working class men, men of colour or disabled men, and so they're excluded from this status. So already the theories that are out there are unpacking masculinity as not one thing, you know, it's not one type of identity. There's lots of different factions underneath, you know, that title of masculinity. Next slide, please. However, Connell herself critiqued her work and talked about this framework as a model. It's not a fixed rule, so masculinity can be fluid and diverse, and you might have a different type of identity in different situations, on different days, in different contexts. And men and boys might not identify with any of those specific categories explicitly. It could be seen as overly structured and might ignore individuality. And it doesn't fully capture non-binary or gender fluid identities. So an alternative view to this is that masculinity can be seen on a spectrum, and it's shaped by lots of different aspects, such as personal, cultural and social factors. Next slide, please. There's another concept that I talk about in the work that I've done called precarious masculinity. And when we apply this lens, especially in my work to young men and boys, it's really evident that you can see these stages emerging. So the three stages are gaining status. So young men and boys within society are seen as having to kind of battle to get that hegemonic status, you know, to be what my working class non-academic mom would call, you know, top dog status. They have to battle their way up there in using lots of different means. But then when they get there, they have to maintain that status. And because it's hard won and easily lost. So there's a fragility and a vulnerability around being at this kind of the top of the ladder. And they have to demonstrate that status, and that's how they maintain it. And this might be through demonstrations of violence or sexual harassment, so subordinating someone through sexual harassment to elevate themselves. So I'm not saying that all of the instances of sexual harassment are linked to this. You know, quite often they are for sexual gratification, but it's always useful to apply this lens. You know, why are people acting in this way and subordinating perhaps a woman? And it's might be to elevate themselves within this status of masculinity, that they have to keep demonstrating this status. And to be within this kind of this context is especially exhausting for young men and boys, and it's a very vulnerable position. Next slide, please. Another aspect that I wanted to talk about was this perspective of privilege. Quite often when we meet people, we make assumptions, we make cognitive shortcuts based on what we can see and what we can see about them. And that's generally their gender, the colour of their skin, and whether they're able-bodied or not. So quite more often than not, when young men and boys are seen within society, they're seen as privileged. However, the picture is a lot more complex than that. Next slide, please. So privilege, to define it, isn't about having an easy life. It's about what you don't have to think about. However, and this is the key aspect here that I think is quite often missed in current narratives and rhetoric that we see online, being a man isn't always a privilege. If it means hiding pain, never asking for help, or proving strength 24/7, it can be exhausting. And privilege is layered. You can have it in one area of your life and be excluded in another. But if you're never questioned, interrupted or doubted, that's privilege. But that doesn't always just lend itself to men. You know, we have to draw away from this perception of men and boys as one group, one homogenous group. There are so many different identities within that. However, privilege also doesn't make an individual bad, you know, but ignoring it makes the systems worse. However, is masculinity a gift or a trap? And I think, you know, both Aisha and Nina and Ian have alluded to this in their talk. You know, masculinity is seen as a privilege, but is it really? So if we move on to the next slide, please. So here are some examples where privilege works for men, but it also fails men at the same time. So it's really conflicting. So work and leadership, they're more likely to be hired or promoted, but there's a pressure to succeed, and failure equals shame. For instance, in dating, they're in a socially dominant role, but it fails men in that aspect because emotional needs are often overlooked. In mental health, they're seen as strong and resilient, but there is a stigma around seeking help, and suicide is the biggest killer of men under 45. In education, they're encouraged in STEM subjects, but there's higher dropout and suspension rates. And abuse victimhood. So in a lot of the areas of my work around sexual violence and sexual abuse, they're less likely to be targeted. However, when they are, they're not believed or supported if they are victimised. Next slide, please. It's really important to understand the changing role of the man in current contemporary society. So for over the last 50 years, women and girls have been largely supported in the evolution of their role. That's not to say there's not a long way to go for the equity and equal opportunities for women and girls. There absolutely is. However, over the last 50 years, that our role has changed within society. So we have access to abortion, we have access to contraception, so we have bodily autonomy, we're part of the labour market, and we don't need a man in that traditional sense anymore to run a household and be the main earner. And there has been a lot of scaffolding and support in the evolution of our identity as women in society. However, over the last 50 years, that same support system and that scaffolding has not existed for men and boys. And what I found in a lot of the research projects that I've carried out, certainly, is that young men and boys are freewheeling at the moment. They're looking for identity. They're looking for where they fit, you know, where is their place within this kind of new perspective of being a man. Next slide, please. So if we keep that in mind, what's happened over the last 50 years, there's been a vacuum created within society, and these freewheeling young men and males looking for direction and identity. And so within this vacuum, people like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and other very damaging influencers have managed to get a foothold. They have got traction because society has caused the vacuum into which young men and boys are seemingly lost and looking for direction. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight the importance of recognising intersectionality with young men and boys. This is something that I've seen quite often missed within discourses and narratives around young men and boys, whereas people are just talking about men and boys and not really recognising all the different components to make them who they are. So gender identity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It intersects with race, class, sexuality, neurodivergence, you know, all the different things, the puzzle pieces that make us who we are, our individual selves. So not all men experience masculinity in the same way. And looking at things through an intersectional lens in the masculine and male space helps us understand these layered experiences, and it builds a culture that can support. So instead of just seeing that man or boy standing in front of you, actually take a step back as a professional and think, you know, what is their intersectional identity? They might be a young carer, they might care for elderly relatives, you know, they might have mental health issues. These are all the things that form part of their person and who they are that we can't see, and we must recognise the importance of intersectionality and how that intersects with perceptions of privilege as well. Next slide, please. So I wanted to, next slide, please. So I want to now come on to talk a little bit about the research project called We're in This Together, the Voice of Boys. But before I do so, I just wanted to allude to a few of the research projects that I've led. So I carried out a discourse analysis on Reddit on incel behaviour, so looked at incel forums. And what was really interesting about this project is that when I went into the project, I was really bracing myself to read some pretty awful things that might be quite upsetting, quite violent. What I didn't prepare myself for was how sad I would feel when I read a lot of these posts. There was so much self-depreciation, there was suicide ideation, there was really low self-esteem, and many of the men and boys, especially the young men and boys, had been kind of tipped into these forums looking for identity because they felt so low about themselves. I carried out an extensive sexual behaviour study on the sexual behaviours of 13 to 18-year-olds in a UK context. And one of the really interesting findings from that study was that we tend to see men and boys as being sexually motivated all of the time, don't we? However, a large-scale survey that I carried out demonstrated that the sexual experiences and motivating factors for young men and boys are so vastly different that, you know, sexual motivation isn't their main driver. And this is something that's led me on to change the discourse, or to try to change the discourse within society on perceptions of consent. You know, for instance, we always see the woman or young or girl as the gatekeeper and the boy or man as the instigator, when actually the research demonstrates to us that it's a lot more complex than that. I carried out a study of masculinity in the fire service, and that really brought home to me, you know, this importance of intersectionality. You know, look behind what you can see. You know, what are the individual identities of the people that you're working with, and what does that mean in this instance for workplace culture? I also produced a resource for relationships and sex education. I worked with 13 and 14 and 15-year-old, primarily young men and boys in a school setting, and they were just so inspirational. And this really did demonstrate to me that young people and young men and boys have agency, and we quite often miss this. You know, this was a participatory project that they were absolutely phenomenal in. They designed a booklet called A Student's Guide to What You Don't Know, a guidance for schools, and then they went and presented it to academics at the University of Birmingham. You know, we must never underestimate young people and young men and boys. I also carried out a graffiti project. I didn't do the graffiti, by the way. I had a graffiti artist, primarily with young men and boys. Quite a lot of these young men and boys had been excluded from a number of schools, and this demonstrated the importance of safe spaces for young men and boys to talk. And it might not be sitting in a room that's really kind of constructed. It might be on a graffiti project. And some of the conversations that I had with those young men on that project was so rich, just while we were kind of setting up the graffiti project and carrying it out. I've also got a sexual health and period poverty project in Sierra Leone in West Africa. And it's been one of the most profound learning experiences that I've been lucky enough to have. And in one of the NGOs that work in sexual health, especially out in the villages, on their wall they've got written, "You don't have to be anti-man to be pro-woman." You know, and that really did stay with me. You know, this is something we really need to learn about and take on board. Next slide, please. So the project that I want to talk about is linked to the lack of perspective and on boys' voice, the perceptions of masculinity that I spoke about, and it was to construct a picture of how boys perceive boyhood and masculinity. Next slide, please. So it consisted of 3 initial focus groups of young men between the ages of 14 and 19 from different demographics, boys of colour, and also boys that had been excluded from school, and also middle class boys. And then the second stage consisted of 16 focus groups with boys that were aged 15 and 16, again with different demographical components. Next slide, please. The 4 key themes that came out of this were, the first one was grievance. You know, that they felt aggrieved, they're always blamed, they felt that they were shut out of conversations, not at the detriment, I must caveat, to young women and girls, but they felt like they were in a really difficult position and they couldn't speak, and they couldn't speak up when they felt that, you know, things were unfair to them. And this lent them to stick to a social script and not say how they really felt, because they didn't ever feel that there were safe spaces for them. There was the hegemonic precarious masculinity that I spoke about earlier. That was really evident. And what I found was the conflict between the internal and external self was really evident. So that internal self, who we are as individuals, intersectional individuals, but it really did conflict with how boys and young men are expected to act on the outside world, you know. And I'm 46. I used to be able to shut the door on school when I got home. Young men and boys can't do that anymore. So their lives are lived seamlessly online and offline. And there was a really key theme that came out of hopelessness and worthlessness. You know, they didn't feel that they were worthy. And there was a hopelessness because they didn't see that things could get better for them. Next slide, please. There was a distinct perspective of lack of voice. They talked about harassment also happening to them. They talked about that mental health in a really astute way with so much agency. They talked about the impact of porn but they also talked about the impact of blame culture on them. Next slide, please. They talked about what can't be said. There's an unfairness of the position, but they knew they couldn't say it was not all men. They were really hyper vigilant and aware that this has been hijacked by by groups that are quite right wing and bigoted. But they did know that they couldn't say things without being judged or silent. And they talked about a need for support for men and boys. Next slide, please. So I just want to make the case for reframing masculinity for young men and boys. The way we see the world is our frames, that shapes the way we see the world around us. So reframing changes our perspective. Masculinity is a frame that we look at, and negative framing has consequences. So reframing and really thinking about these concepts promotes conscious thinking. Next slide, please. But it always has to start with yourself. How do you really feel about young men and boys? And, sometimes this might be a really hard question to answer. If you're going to be completely honest with yourselves, how do you approach young men and boys when you're working with them? Do you approach them with judgment and preconceptions, or do you approach them with young people with agency and individual identities? Next slide, please. So I just wanted to end with a few slides with quotes from young men and boys that I've worked with. So this was from a young man, age 15. I don't even know what a normal boy is supposed to be anymore. You get told so many different things and they all contradict each other. Next slide, please. Another young man, age 16. There's no place for how we actually feel. We just have to get on with it and not be soft. You get told to man up even when everything is just a bit too much. It's not that we don't want to talk, it's that no one listens when we do. Next slide, please. A young man, age 14, said, it's like there's this blueprint of how you have to be as a man. You have to tick all the boxes. Don't cry, be tough, fix things. Don't ever be vulnerable. It's exhausting. Next slide, please. So 3 more quotes. One from a young man, age 15, you get beaten down until you don't care anymore. And that's when you become the kind of boy they expect. A young man, age 14, said, no one ever asks us what we think. They just tell us what not to do, like we're problems to fix instead of people to talk to. A young man, age 14, said, I feel like being a man is something that is seen as quite a negative thing in our lives right now. We're always told we are part of the problem, but never allowed to be part of the solution. Next slide, please. So just to end, on the right of the screen, the paler picture, that's the book that I've written. However, the darker picture is the free resource that goes with it. So if you Google that, or I'm sure Graham can share it, is We're in This Together, Reframing Masculinity for Young Men and Boys, that unpicks and talks about all of these concepts, but also is a guidance for educators, parents, carers, and professionals in this space. Next slide, please. So here you'll find my contact details. All my work is on those social media platforms, and I'll hand back to Graham, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you to all our presenters. And Sophie, your point about resources just reminds me to say to all our participants that everyone who registered for the webinar, we'll send you an email probably next week now with a link to the recording of the webinar, and also resources that people have mentioned. So now we're going to take a 5-minute comfort break, and when we come back, as I mentioned earlier, my colleague Raymond Taylor will chair a panel session, a virtual panel session with all our speakers, framed around questions that you've put on the Q&A, or others that Raymond has devised for the discussion. So we'll go to the break now.
So welcome back, colleagues. Can I ask all the contributors to switch their cameras on if they would? And we'll begin our question and answer session. We've set 15 minutes aside for this. The first thing, kind of thank all of the presenters for their very thoughtful contributions, and in particular for the forensic analysis that they brought to this discussion, and also the compassion that that's run through each of the presentations. I think I'd like to begin by asking each of our contributors if they could comment on a question that came in through the QA quite early on in the proceedings this evening, which was in terms of men's and boys' help-seeking behaviours and the use of online resources. Do you have a sense of people resorting to use AI before they use anything else? And is that problematic? And I'll start with Aisha, and then I'll go to Sophie.
Raymond, you were breaking up there. I don't know if it was just me, but I don't think it was. So
Yeah, I couldn't hear the question. It was quite I wasn't sure if it was my internet, but I don't think it was it?
no, I think it was everyone's. I think Raymond's frozen.
Yeah.
I
Raymond,
think Raymond. Sorry, Graham.
Raymond, if you want to turn your camera off and just use audio, your connection's dropped off.
So I can pick it up. I think he was asking about the first question, which was in terms of men and boys seeking mental health support online. Have you found that more are turning to AI for advice? From my perspective, in the study that I did, or the studies that I've completed, they finished about a year ago, and AI has moved on dramatically since then. But even in the last year, and it feels wild saying that, doesn't it? But I know that they were turning to platforms for help seeking, and Googling. A lot of them are still using Twitter, which I found was quite interesting. But I wonder if, Aisha, that this is more aligned with your work in terms of mental health help seeking.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I think that's a really, really interesting question. And as you said as well, our review was carried out in 2023. So obviously the papers that we included were from 10 years prior to that. And so it was before ChatGPT and other AI tools really took off, and that's probably why it's not reflected in our review findings. But we found a similar thing, that young men were talking about preferring search engines and speaking to someone on the internet. I think from like anecdotal evidence, we hear that young people sort of in general are turning more to chatbots to get help for their mental health. And I know there is some research out there already on how young people are using it, but I know that again, there doesn't seem to be much on how young men specifically are using AI, and that was something reflected in our review in general, that there just isn't enough research looking at young men specifically. But I do think that would be a really interesting point for future research, because if young men are more likely to seek help online in the first place, then it would also follow that they're more likely to use AI chatbots for support. And so, it might mean that they're more at risk of receiving low quality or, even potentially dangerous information when seeking help. There has been, again, anecdotal evidence of that, about the risk of suicide and things like that being almost recommended by chatbots. But having said that, obviously we know that AI can be used for good as well. So perhaps we need to look at, developing AI tools for young men to use that are high quality and reliable. And, we could embrace AI rather than seeing it as like an inherently bad thing. Lots to think about for like future, different avenues for future research. I guess to answer the question in short, we can make an assumption, but I guess we don't have enough information to confirm it. It would be an interesting point to explore. I mean, I don't know, Nina and Ian, I know you work more directly with young men, so you might have something more to share on that perspective.
I can jump. Well, I suppose one of the glaringly obvious things is I work with young men in custody who don't have access to any internet on the most part. So that's fairly restrictive. But I suppose one of the things that we have been having extensive conversations around, which doesn't answer the question actually, but actually around the sort of lack of education around where AI is being used. So some of the conversations around algorithms, so like the sort of toxic influencers that go around and how that continually finds its way onto feeds, etc. I think a lot of the young men that we are working with understand an algorithm as a concept that exists, but don't actually understand that is an AI working to put information in front of them. And I think as you say, that there is opportunities here for it to work for good, but there are also opportunities just to upskill and educate young men on how and why some of the content that they're getting is ending up in front of them as well. And we raise awareness on that.
Thanks, Ian. That's me back on. But Nina could come in now, and then we'll go to Sophie.
Yeah, I don't probably have too much to add to what's already been said. In Men Minds, we didn't explore AI specifically. But what young men did say was that they did often turn to the internet for advice or support or connection. And Reddit was, for some of them, actually quite a supportive type of environment in relation to seeking help for their mental health. So I think that assumption is, AI is now so prevalent and it's the first thing that gets returned on a Google search that I think we can make that assumption that AI is a source of information for young men, whether that's accurate or misinformation remains to be seen. But again, I think it exists, it's developing, it's growing. We can't ignore that it is there. So I think I agree with you, Aisha, that we can also see it as a force for good, particularly for young men who might be quite isolated or lonely or looking for connection with other people like themselves that might not exist in their physical communities. So yeah, I think more and more we can assume that is a factor, but we shouldn't necessarily discount it, I think.
Okay, thanks, Nina. Yeah, I'm going to Sophie now, thanks.
Yeah, so in terms of this, I think what we've got to remember is that many young men and boys do not see themselves in healthcare services. It's not set up for them. In the work that I've done in child sexual abuse and harmful sexual behaviour, men and boys consistently tell us that they don't see themselves in services. So it stands to reason that they're going to turn to the internet. Also, in the Incel project that I carried out, it was really interesting because the written word at that time, so that was only a year ago, seemed to be shifting onto reels. And that kind of quick hit of constant reels that they're spinning through and looking at. And that's when, as has just been said about the algorithms kick in. So I think that, there's two aspects to this. We are literally running to keep up with what's going on in the digital arena at the moment, but also there's nowhere really for young men and boys and men and boys to go to because they don't see themselves in support services. And I think that was a key thread that was throughout all of our talks.
Thanks, Sophie. When Ian spoke, he finished quite powerfully on this concept of leaning in, right? And Sophie, you spoke about the importance of scaffolding. And those two things seem to me to be connected in some ways, but there's a question that was on the chat there, which was about the role, and this is really about the skills of particular professionals, the roles of youth work. And there's two elements of that. One is the kind of lack of investment in youth work and community development over the last 10, 20 years. But the other is the potential for those professionals in particular to engage with young men in online type communities and whether that's got potential. So I'll go to Ian first and then I'll come back to Sophie.
Yes, so I'd rather we peek at the questions as they were coming in. And yes, I think, I'm not sure who is to blame, so I'm not going to lay that at anyone's feet. I think this investment in youth work has been catastrophic, and the current funding model means that the tail now wags the dog and outcomes are predetermined and set by funding models as they exist. I think we also have a real shift. I think we've actually got a shift in youth work fundamentally that hasn't aligned with how youth work is perceived. So I think youth work, we kind of picture this universal relationship building, your kind of Biker Grove type setting, and it doesn't exist like that anymore. I think what the funding model means that there is a lot of short-term projects, 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year, which are targeted at certain groups with a certain topic, with, as I said, certain predicted outcomes. And I think that has led to us having a romanticised view of what youth work is now. And I think youth work as it was would absolutely have been an integral player. And I say this as a youth worker and as somebody who's a huge fan of youth work as a sector and as a skill. But I don't think we are in the place that a lot of people think we are. And I think youth work is often given or has the responsibility thrust upon it to be the solution to a lot of the problems that we have in society. And the consistent underfunding has meant, despite being given the responsibility, they no longer have the capacity. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ian. And Sophie, the same question to you.
Yeah, so I will lay it at people's feet, and it is the government have chronically underfunded this really valuable piece of work within society that actually stops adverse long-term outcomes for young men and boys. You know, that like I said, you know, you can't, with some groups of young men and boys, you can't just sit around in a room with some tea and biscuits. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't operate like that. But you've got to fund the training. You've got to fund the resources. You've got to fund the things that are right for the context into which those young men and boys are situated within. You know, sometimes they might turn to online spaces, as you mentioned, to go into chat rooms. But many of the young men and boys that I've worked with that have been excluded from a lot of different schools are generally not going to sit online and be in a chat room. You know, they're going to be out somewhere doing something, you know, and, you know, hopefully there's a pocket there with a good youth worker and a youth space, but it's highly unlikely because of absolutely the massive dismantling of the youth service over the last 10 to 15 years, you know, and I think we've got to have these real candid conversations about what we've lost over the last 15 years, but actually look at the impact now. Look, nothing's getting better. You know, we need to look at outcomes, at long-term outcomes, mental health outcomes, criminal justice outcomes. Violence in young men and boys is not reducing at any dramatic rate. What haven't we got? Consistent funding for youth work. You know, it's really frustrating when you work in this space, as all of us might probably agree, that when you can actually see a really clear solution to help a lot of young men and boys that's evidence-based, that isn't being funded, and the infrastructures are just not there. And a lot of people do it out of goodwill, and there's a lot of good volunteers out there that are the unsung heroes in a lot of young men and boys' lives.
Absolutely. Thanks. That's Sophie. It's clear that about a vacuum there, which is increasingly being exposed. I'd like to move on now, and I'll put this question to Nina and Aisha, and it's to do with the issue of boys' agency. And I think that came up early on in Nina's presentation, where she spoke about the issue of gender. So when men and boys were seeking help, does it make a difference whether it's a man or a woman who provides that? So I'm going to put that to Nina first, and then Aisha. I'm going to come to Ian with the same question.
Thank you for the question, Raymond. I'm just thinking to what the young men in Men Minds told us, and in relation to the gender of the person providing support, mental health support or otherwise, I think it varied. And I think the most important thing was care, compassion, listening, being there because you genuinely care rather than it was just your job, which was why I think peer support or lived experience was so highly valued. It did differ for the young men we spoke to, though some preferred to speak to a woman, partly because they maybe expected a more compassionate response or because they felt they weren't losing face. In one of the early sessions where we had our young people's forum and we had 10 young men sitting in a room answering this question, they were very adamant that they wouldn't really share with other young men. But I kind of pointed out the fact that they were sitting in a room sharing with other young men. They were like, well, this is the purpose of this, and other people are sharing. And And I had some quotes on the slides. There was a lot of information on those slides, so hopefully you can see them on the recording, but where people were talking about just being blown away by hearing somebody else being able to talk and be vulnerable. So having that support from other boys, other men, other young men like them, or other men out there was really valuable and showed them other ways of being a man. But there were also some men who very much felt the weight of that, the sort of judgment and history, and that they felt that if they approached women with their problems, they might be seen as, other people have things much worse, and women have it much worse, and men are the source of problems in society, and so you don't really have a right to be feeling like that. So they were very conflicted, where sometimes they felt speaking to women would be easier, sometimes it wasn't, sometimes speaking to men would be easier. But I think the most important thing was care, compassion, understanding, and that quite often came from peers and came from lived experience.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. And Aisha?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, just thinking about sort of some of our review findings on this. I think probably one of the main things that young men talked about was the idea of having that positive male role model that they could look to, and could just help them see that help seeking was sort of a positive thing. And again, that talking about mental health was a sort of positive thing. And I think we have seen that reflected in some sort of public health, social media campaigns in trying to get those kind of positive male figures to reach out and connect with young men. And definitely the young men in the studies we looked at, they reflected that was really important for them to see maybe someone who'd been through those same experiences and had got through it. It was really important for them to see that. And I think some young men as well shared the same for seeing that in professionals as well. Like for a lot of them, if they'd been in contact with professionals, it had only been women. So actually having contact with a male professional, especially for young men from marginalized communities, so from Black communities or LGBTQ communities, if they saw a professional who was from the same ethnic sexual background as them, that really helped them to feel like, oh, this is something that actually I'm reflected in sort of in the service. That was something that was really important to them. And I think as well, from the BEST study that I mentioned on the school workshops, as I said, we knew from our focus groups that young men shared the same thing about the male role models, and so we tried to put that into practice with our recruitment procedures. And we put the research into practice. And when we went into schools, when we were sort of setting up for the recruitment sessions, we said to the sort of senior leadership, do you have a male teacher in school who the young men really look up to? Sometimes that was like someone in senior leadership. Sometimes it was just like a PE teacher or someone like that who was really popular. Seeing someone in that more traditional masculine role and having them come along to the recruitment sessions really helped. And it worked for BEST because actually we had a really strong representation of boys and young men. So it does show that, those approaches really do work.
Does that affirm the whole thing? Yeah, I'm with you. That's good. Thanks, Isha. I'm conscious of time. I'm keen to really ask Ian in particular to comment on that question, but really from something that was running through my mind as you spoke, which was working in that particular institution. I'm familiar with it. It's the vulnerability that young boys and young men that expose themselves to by sharing their feelings with each other in an environment where you have to be, I would imagine, quite resilient, and you need to be independent in order to survive. So, Ian, could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as Aisha was talking, and to me, there was a stark difference in that when I speak to the young men that I'm working with, if it's to do with mental health or vulnerability, they almost exclusively would prefer to speak to females. Now, I don't think that's because they inherently think females offer something that men can't. As I think that those particular young men that I'm working with are crying out for male role models that don't exist. I think almost every man that they'll come into contact with has an authority or a power dynamic over them. within that environment. The prison environment itself is a hyper-masculine environment that is designed to contain them, and I think then asking them to be vulnerable within that is very, very difficult. What I have found almost overwhelmingly is when you go lean into what it is that about speaking with a woman that's different from a man is because they associate that with care and compassion and nurture. And when you try and be that, and there's another couple of young men, not young men, young men that are working in that environment through Glass Theatre and various other places, when you go in there with love and compassion and empathy and be vulnerable yourself and talk about emotions and give them permission to share their own, then it pours out of them. And I think it is actually, as nice as it is, it's tragic because they are desperately seeking men that they can emulate. And I think there just are not enough, particularly in that environment because of the way that they're contained. But there's a particular dynamic in there that's hard to escape. But it's something that is needed, and I think we need more men to step into those spaces. And I think I think this is a man's problem to address. Like obviously, women need to be part of that as well. But we're talking about a patriarchal system which has existed for hundreds, not thousands of years. And even the three lead researchers in the country that are on this call are women. And I think for me, there's no longer an acceptable way to duck out of this. And I think as men, we need to step up and we need to show our young men that it's okay to feel your emotions before they even talk about them. I think some of them are pushed so far down that we've got young men that are so out of touch with what emotions are, that the only thing they know how to express is anger and joy. And I think we need to be showing them that other emotions aren't just acceptable, they're normal, and they need to be seeing the men in their life being the ones to step into that space.
Thanks for that, Ian. And I'm also reflecting on a comment that Sophie made, which is that we're more of the same than we are different. So just before I hand back to Graham, Sophie, did you have a view on that particular question?
Yeah, just to come in on what Ian was saying, he's absolutely right when he talks about vulnerability, and this is something that I've written about, is that generally, because the only times that men have shown vulnerability has been with either when they're younger, so probably with a female caregiver, so a parent carer, or a primary school teacher. So there's that link there in terms of vulnerability and wanting to go to a woman, because that's probably the only model they've got in their life of that kind of blueprint of where they've shown vulnerability, and then all the different layers that Ian spoke about. And then just briefly on role models, they're not inherently good or bad, and it's about the impact that they have. So a role model is someone who someone identifies with, who shares similar traits or experiences, or that aspirational ideal. So if young men and boys are feeling aggrieved and angry and freewheeling, they're going to look to those people. So a role model isn't inherently good or bad, but it's the impact that they're having. So a couple of key examples are Marcus Rashford and Andrew Tate. Okay, very different types of men, but share very similar masculine traits, which is, but it's the impact that they've had is really vital here to consider.
Okay, thank you, that's Sophie. And on that note, I'll pass over to Graham, who's an ideal role model. Graham.
Thank you very much, Raymond. And there were some questions that we didn't have in the Q&A. We didn't have time to get to, for example, some questions about Parliament being in the central belt of Scotland and whether there might be ways of getting support out to other parts of Scotland in more rural areas. And there's a question specifically asking about having virtual support or online support. And if our presenters have got ideas about that, then we can maybe get them out to those who registered after the webinar. So now we're coming to the end of the webinar. Thank you to our participants for joining us. We hope you find the presentations informative and helpful to you in your work or volunteering role. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank the presenters, Nina and Ian, Aisha and Sophie, for their talks this evening and for engaging with your questions. Thanks also to Raymond Taylor for framing and chairing the discussion, and for his persistence in getting back in when he was bumped out temporarily. Thanks also to Nadia Mitchell of the University's Corporate Events for organising this webinar, and to Alan McCleave, our technical wizard who's been in the background, for providing support. Special thanks from us to Professor Neil Quinn and his colleagues in the Department of Social Work and Social Policy for promoting this webinar in the department's seminar programme. The webinar was, as you know, recorded and will be placed in due course on the university's YouTube channel. And Alan, if we can up the final slide now, which shows a link to the Kilbrandon lecture archive. There's a QR code on there. I don't know if that's showing at the moment, is it? And that provides details of all Kilbrandon lectures and webinars. I think Alan is getting that up for us. Yeah, if you can. Oh, there we are. Yeah. That QR code should take you, if you use your camera to capture it, that should take you to the Social Work and Social Policy Department's website, and specifically to the archive of past Kilbrandon lectures and webinars. Have a very good evening and look forward to your participation in next year's Kilbrandon lecture and the Children's Research webinar. Good night.